On the morning of September 3rd, 1878, a country minister drove 10 miles north to a drugstore in Middletown, Connecticut, and bought 1 ounce of arsenic. He told the clerk it was for rats. That afternoon, the young woman who had once worked in his house walked into the woods behind her father's farm and did not come back. 6 weeks later, chemists at Yale opened her stomach in a laboratory and found the poison still sitting there, undissolved. What followed was one of the longest and most expensive criminal trials in 19th century America. It ran for more than 3 months. It emptied the county treasury. It brought 15 physicians and a row of Yale professors into a New Haven courtroom to argue about the shape of crystals under a microscope. And at the end of it, after 82 hours of deliberation, 12 men walked back into that courtroom and admitted they could not agree. No one was ever convicted. The case has never been closed. This is the murder of Mary Stannard. 10 miles inland from the Connecticut shore, in the northern corner of the town of Madison, there was a settlement called Rockland. It was not a village in any formal sense. It was a scatter of small farms pressed into stony hillsides, connected by cart roads that turned to mud in autumn. The nearest railway station was 10 miles away. The soil was thin. The people who worked it cut wood, kept a cow or two, and hired themselves out to neighbours when the season allowed. New England in the 1870s was already tilting toward the factory towns. Young people were leaving hill country like Rockland for New Haven, Hartford, Bridgeport. Those who stayed lived close to the margin, and they lived very close to one another. In a place that size, a household's business was rarely private. There were 2 institutions in Rockland that held the community together, the school and the small Methodist church. Both of them would sit at the centre of what happened next. Mary Elizabeth Stannard was born on the 3rd of September 1856. Her father, Charles Sylvester Stannard, was a small, weathered farm labourer of about 40, described in the court record as hard of hearing and slow of speech. The family shared a modest house on the road south of the Rockland Hills, along with Mary's half-sister Susan Hawley. Contemporary accounts of Mary are remarkably consistent, and they are worth quoting carefully, because the language of 1878 is not the language we would use now. The witnesses called her simple, easy-minded, easily led. One newspaper of the period reached for a cruder phrase still. Underneath the era's vocabulary, what those accounts are describing is a young woman who was trusting, literal-minded, and unusually easy to persuade. About 2 years before her death, Mary gave birth to a son outside of marriage. She named him Willie. The father was a married man from a neighbouring town. In most New England communities of that decade, that would have ended her standing permanently. In Rockland, it did not. Her neighbours closed around her instead. The record shows that they nursed her through her confinement, found her work, and made a point of treating her as someone who had been wronged rather than someone who had sinned. When she died, the man who wrote the first account of the case described her simply as Poor Mary, and the phrase stuck to her for a century. She took whatever work she could find: washing, cleaning, dairy work, minding children. And in April of 1877, at the request of the minister's wife, she began working at the house of the Reverend Herbert Hayden. Herbert Hiram Hayden was 28 years old in 1878. He was not, strictly speaking, an ordained minister. He had studied at the seminary at East Greenwich and then at Middletown, and he was working his way toward full ordination the slow way through temporary appointments, on very small salaries, while carrying the debts his education had left behind. He had also trained as a carpenter, and he still worked at the trade when the church could not pay him. He was married to Rosa, whom he had wed in Massachusetts in 1871. By the summer of 1878, they had 3 children, the youngest only weeks old. Rosa taught at the Rockland school and ran the small farm while her husband was away. A reporter who watched him in court described a short man with dark curling hair and a weather-reddened face, dressed in black, looking far more like a farmer than a clergyman. In 1876 he was appointed to preach at the Methodist Church in Rockland. He held it for about a year. Then the congregation told him they could no longer meet his salary, and he was moved to the church at Madison Center further to travel and less to show for it. Through the week he was away, Rosa was home alone with the children. That is how Mary Stannard came into the house. She worked there in the spring of 1877, and again from December of 1877 through March of 1878, sleeping at the parsonage on the nights the minister was away. The neighbours began to talk. They said the two had been seen walking together in the lots, and in unfrequented places, in the evenings. One story circulated more than the others. In March of 1878, the church held an oyster supper. Rosa and her husband attended. Mary stayed behind with the children. At some point in the evening, Hayden excused himself and walked back to the house to check on them. The rumour was that something happened during that absence. At the time, it was only a rumour. Within 6 months, it would be the state's theory of motive. On the 18th of August 1878, Mary left Rockland to work for a family named Studley in Guildford. 11 days later, Jane Studley noticed that the girl had stopped speaking, was moving through her work in a fog, and had begun to cry without explanation. She asked her what was wrong. Mary told her that she had been intimate with the Reverend Hayden beginning one night in March, and that she believed she was about 5 months pregnant. Mrs. Studley advised her to go to Hayden directly and ask for help. Mary did something slightly different. She wrote a letter to her half-sister Susan and sealed inside it a second letter, addressed to the minister. She told Mrs. Studley what that inner letter said. She was asking Hayden to take her to New Haven to end the pregnancy, and then to bring her back to Guildford to recover. When Edgar Studley learned what was being planned under his roof, he refused any part of it. He drove Mary home to her father's house that Sunday. She arrived before the letter did. When it came, she took the sealed envelope out of her sister's hands and destroyed it. She said there was no need for it now. She would speak to him herself. She saw him on the Monday. According to Susan Hawley, Mary came back and reported that Hayden had promised to get her some medicine that week. Tuesday, the 3rd of September 1878, was Mary Stannard's 22nd birthday. It was hot and close. Between 6 and 7 in the morning, Herbert Hayden drove out of Rockland alone in a top buggy. By his own testimony, he went to Middletown for horse feed, for sugar and molasses and fuller's earth for the baby, and to collect a set of carpenter's tools a man named Burton had promised him. He did not find Burton. He did meet Dr. Leonard Bailey, an old acquaintance who had attended Rosa through a difficult confinement. Under cross-examination, the prosecutor asked Dr. Bailey whether Hayden had put a particular question to him that morning, whether a woman 5 months pregnant could still have her regular periods. Bailey could not recall the exact wording, but confirmed that something along those lines had been asked. He assumed the minister was asking about his own wife. Hayden's last stop was Tyler's drugstore, where he purchased 1 ounce of arsenic. He said it was for rats in his barn. At about 11, driving home, he stopped at the Stannard house and asked for a glass of water. He found it too warm and set it down. Mary said she would go to the spring for cooler water and left with her pail. Hayden drove off in the same direction. Susan Hawley later testified that Mary told her the minister had signalled her to follow him to the spring, and that at the spring he told her he had been to Middletown, had seen a doctor, and had obtained something that would help. She was to meet him in an hour at the Big Rock. Hayden went home. He opened oysters for dinner with his jackknife. He made the beds, signed a document relating to his wife's mother's estate, smoked, and lay on the floor playing with his children. A little after 1 o'clock, Mary took a tin pail, tied on her sunbonnet, and told the household she was going for blackberries. Her father watched her walk toward the wood. At about 2:15, Hayden told Rosa he was going into the swamp lot to throw out firewood. His children walked him to the fork in the road. Rosa watched from the dining room window as he went out of sight past Burr's barn. Between them at that hour lay about 12 minutes of woodland, a distance 3 neighbours later walked, at a fast pace, and timed. Eliza Mills lived north of the Stannards. That afternoon she had been visiting, and she was walking home along the road near the Bury Ground with her small son. She heard a shrill scream from the woods. She stopped. She told the boy to listen. Then, badly frightened, she hurried home. She looked at the clock when she came through the door. It read 25 minutes to 4. The clock, she said, ran about 15 minutes fast, and the walk had taken her 5 minutes. That places the scream at roughly 20 past 3 in the afternoon. If I had thought at that time it was a human voice, she told the court, I should have gone there, weak as I was. Rain began to fall around 4. At about the same hour, Rosa Hayden saw her husband come up through the potato patch, calling for his daughter to bring him a basket. He had been gone, by her account, an hour and 3/4. Charles Stannard came in from haying between 4 and 5 and found his daughter had not returned. He walked out toward the berry ground, calling her name. He came back. He went out again. At about 6 o'clock, on a footpath a short distance from the house, he saw the colours of her dress. He called to her. She did not answer. He ran down the path, touched her hands and her face, and found them cold. Mary Stannard had suffered a wound to the head and a fatal wound to the throat. She was lying on her back, her head thrown back, her hands folded across her stomach. Her clothing was undisturbed. There was no sign of a struggle in the ground around her. Her tin pail lay 3 or 4 feet away upside down. When it was examined, there were no berries in it and no berry stains. He ran for help. Within a short time, about a dozen neighbours stood around the body in the failing light: the Mills family, the Burrs, the Stevenses, and among them the Reverend Herbert Hayden, her pastor. They searched for a weapon. They found nothing. The rain was coming on, and the light was going, so the search was adjourned until morning. Several men, Hayden among them, helped carry her home on a plank. Justice Henry E. Stone was notified and summoned a jury of inquest. At 3 o'clock the next morning, by lamp and lantern light, Dr. Rufus Mathewson of Durham conducted the first post-mortem examination. His conclusion was immediate and unequivocal. This was not suicide. The blow to the head had been struck first, and it had been struck hard enough to knock her down. Whoever inflicted the second wound had done so with some knowledge of where the blood vessels lay. Rockland took 2 days to reach a verdict of its own. By Thursday the whispering had settled on one name, and at 2 o'clock on Friday morning the local grand juror, a man also named Charles Stannard, unrelated to the family, rode down and woke Justice of the Peace Henry Wilcox out of his bed, demanding a warrant for the minister's arrest. Wilcox refused. He said he had sat under Hayden's preaching the Sunday before and heard a very good sermon. He said he would sooner sign his own death warrant. The warrant was signed elsewhere. At sunrise on Friday the 6th of September, Deputy Sheriff Hull rode to North Madison and arrested Herbert Hayden. The examination opened the following Monday in the town hall at Madison, which was in practice the basement of the First Congregational Church. It was a low, airless room, so dark that kerosene lamps burned all day. The presiding magistrate was Justice Wilcox. He was not a trained judge. He was a justice of the peace and the registrar of vital statistics, and he had signed Mary Stannard's death certificate a few days earlier. He also belonged to the same Masonic lodge as the accused. Not one of these facts was hidden. All of them would be raised afterward. For the state appeared Judge H. Lynd Harrison and James I. Hayes for the defence, Samuel F. Jones of Hartford, then the most experienced criminal lawyer in Connecticut. Reporters came up from New York. The illustrated papers ran engravings of the minister, the victim, and the path. The state's case ran into a wall almost immediately, and the wall was the law of evidence. Everything Mary had said to Jane Studley, to Edgar Studley, to her own half-sister was hearsay. She could not be cross-examined. Justice Wilcox ruled the substance of it inadmissible. What she had told 3 separate people, consistently, in the last days of her life, the court would not hear. Then came the knife. Professor Moses the C. White of Yale took the stand holding a 2-bladed jackknife belonging to the accused. He testified that he had examined it under a microscope and found blood, and that the blood was human. The courtroom reacted, and then the case fell apart on a procedural point. Harrison refused to let the knife leave the professor's hand. Jones demanded the defence be allowed to handle it. Wilcox ruled that if it went into evidence, all parties could examine it. Harrison told the professor to close the knife, wrap it, and put it back in his pocket, and withdrew it from evidence rather than surrender custody. What followed was a shouting match between 2 of the state's leading attorneys, with the justice rapping vainly for order. The defence answered White with another Yale man, Professor Leonard Sanford, who said he would want 3 times as many blood corpuscles before committing to such an opinion. On the 7th day, Rosa Hayden testified for 2 hours from a rocking chair, still recovering from childbirth. She was composed, precise, and devastating. She accounted for her husband's whole day, the oysters, the jackknife on the shelf above the wood box, the pears she peeled with it the next morning, her small son who had cut his fingers on that same blade more than once. She wept only when her husband's faithfulness was mentioned, and she never wavered on it. On the 8th day, Hayden himself took the stand and denied everything, calmly. On the 9th day, Harrison asked once more for an adjournment so the state could pursue new evidence. Wilcox refused. Harrison walked out of the case. Wilcox then delivered a summing up in which he explained that the blood on the knife had been satisfactorily explained away, that he did not believe Mrs. Hayden capable of lying, and that if he were as certain of heaven as he was of this man's innocence, he would rest content. He ordered the prisoner discharged. The room cheered. 3 weeks later, Hayden preached again to a packed church, with Justice Wilcox seated on the platform beside him. His congregation passed formal resolutions denouncing the prosecution as an outrage. Outside Madison, the press was less impressed. The Springfield Republican called the discharge a mistake and said there had plainly been enough evidence to justify a real trial. Mary Stannard's body did not stay in the ground. It was exhumed and examined repeatedly 4 separate times in all. A second post-mortem, conducted about a week after the murder by Dr. F. A. Jewett and Professor White, established one fact that reversed the meaning of the entire case. Mary Stannard had not been pregnant. There were no signs of pregnancy, and none of any attempt to end one. Her organs were removed and sealed in glass jars for analysis. Professor White, assisted by Professor Samuel W. Johnson of the Sheffield Scientific School, tested the stomach. They found arsenic, not traces en masse of it, sitting undissolved. The 1879 pamphlet published in New Haven put the figure at over 50 grains and said it was enough, in ordinary circumstances, to kill 20 people. A medical journal review published the following year, and most later historians put it at 90 grains. A fatal dose is under 2. Either way, the conclusion was the same. Someone had given Mary Stannard a quantity of poison so far beyond what was needed that it never had time to work. On the 8th of October 1878, the state issued a bench warrant. Hayden was rearrested and taken to the New Haven County Jail. On the 14th, a grand jury heard the principal witnesses and returned a true bill the same evening. There was one more piece. Hayden had told investigators exactly where his arsenic was untouched, in the barn. His own counsel sent a trusted neighbour to retrieve it. The state took possession of it and weighed it. 475 9/10 grains. An ounce is 480. The package he had bought that morning was, to within about 5 grains, entirely intact. The trial did not begin until the 7th of October 1879, more than a year after the murder, delayed in part because the state's attorney had been elected to the United States Senate. It ran for over 3 months and became one of the most closely followed proceedings in the country. More than 100 witnesses were called. 15 physicians, 12 professors from Yale, and 3 more from the University of Pennsylvania. The state built its case on science, on microscopy, on chemistry, on the measurement of arsenic crystals, arguing that the arsenic in Mary Stannard's stomach matched the batch sold at Middletown and did not match the sample sitting in Hayden's barn. It was among the most technically ambitious forensic cases yet attempted in an American courtroom. And it failed to land. The experts contradicted one another. One professor, asked about microscopic measurement, remarked that it was something no ordinary mortal could understand. Another refused to say plainly that he had seen a thing with his own eyes, offering instead that his eyes had seen it. The press mocked them. The jury, 12 laymen, several of them farmers, sat through weeks of it. The defence offered alternatives. Mary's father, Benjamin Stevens, the 61-year-old widower who had been staying at the Stannard house, and who left it shortly after Mary did. Neither had a motive the state could not dismantle, and no blood was found on Stevens' knife or clothing. But the alternatives did not have to be proved. They only had to be raised. Then Hayden and his wife testified again, and were once again calm, warm, and entirely consistent. The case went to the jury on the 16th of January 1880. They deliberated for 82 hours. On the Monday they returned and told the court they could not agree. The split was 11 to 111 for acquittal, 1 for conviction. The single holdout, a farmer, said he simply did not believe the minister or his wife and would not be moved. The jury was discharged. The trial had cost New Haven County at least $30,000, an extraordinary sum for the time. The state's attorney agreed to release Hayden on a nominal bond. He was never retried. Herbert Hayden went back to the Methodist ministry briefly, and then he went back to carpentry. He published his own account of the case in 1880, subtitled Tried on Circumstantial Evidence. He settled in New Haven and opened a small carpenter's shop behind Orange Street. A newspaper caught up with him 7 years later. He had never prospered. A handful of Methodist friends gave him work. The city as a whole did not. The paper had found him only because his property had been attached over an unpaid debt of $85, and the note could not be settled until his wife endorsed it. Rosa Hayden stood by him to the end. He died in New Haven in May of 1907 at 57. The obituary notice that ran was headed simply, "Recalls Stannard Murder." Mary Stannard was buried in Rockland Cemetery in Madison. Contributions were collected from strangers who came to see the place where she died, and a fund was raised toward the support of her son, Willie. The family never got a verdict. There is a temptation, looking back at this case, to treat it as a failure of science. It is not. The chemistry was, for 1879, remarkable. Men in a New Haven laboratory could tell you how much poison was in a dead woman's body, and could argue from the geometry of its crystals about which package it had come from. That was genuinely new. What the Rockland case exposes is something harder. Evidence does not convict anyone. Juries do, and a jury in 1880 was being asked to weigh two things that could not be weighed on the same scale. An argument about microscopy that nobody in the box fully understood, against the sworn word of a minister and his wife, who were composed, sympathetic, and entirely believable. They chose the thing they could understand. There is also the matter of what was never heard at all. Mary Stannard told 3 separate people over several days the same account of who she was meeting and why. She was, by every description, a poor liar and an unlikely schemer. The court excluded all of it as hearsay correctly, under the law as it stood. So the one voice that could have spoken directly to motive was the one voice the law would not admit. The person at the centre of the case was never allowed to appear in it. It should be said clearly, Herbert Hayden was never convicted of anything. He was discharged once and tried once, and the second jury did not find against him. He maintained his innocence for the remaining 27 years of his life. This case remains, formally and permanently, unsolved. But something happened in those woods on the afternoon of the 3rd of September 1878. Someone struck a 22-year-old woman on her own birthday, and then arranged her hands across her body and walked away. And 140-odd years later, the hills above Madison have still not given up the name. If you want more forgotten American cases examined the same way from the primary documents, without embellishment, subscribe to Crimen. There is a new case every week. And tell me in the comments, given what the jury heard and what the jury was never allowed to hear, would you have been the 11 or the 1?